You guys awake this morning?
Yeah.
Those of you guys who went to camp, are you awake? No.
You're awake.
All right. Yeah, camp was so much fun this week. You guys have a good time? Yeah, it was fun. I had a great time hanging out with you guys. Yeah. So here's the thing. If you weren't able to go to camp this year, I would really encourage you guys to make that a priority for next year, if at all possible. Camp is such an awesome thing. Ask the people who went this year. Like, it's so fun. We get to do a lot of fun things. We got to see people get blobbed, and we get to go-kart racing and all these fun things, and swimming together and all. And we also get to get challenged every single day and reading God's Word. And we had a speaker this year, Travis, who I think challenged us in very practical ways. I think we would all agree. For those of you guys who went, it was a great time. So yeah, I just encourage you guys, next year, summer camp happens every single summer, and so make that a priority. I really hope that you can do that next year. This morning, guys, we're in the series called Creative Minority, where we're looking at the story of Daniel. So if you want to follow along, we're going to be reading out of Daniel chapter 6. If you want to open your Bible or use the app or whatever, you can do that. But we're going to start in Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. And we're going to look at a rather classic story in Daniel. That it's pretty familiar to most people, but we're actually going to hone in on a certain part today that I think most of the time we don't focus on. So Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 13 is what we're going to read. And I'm going to get that started. It said, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king wanted to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the administrators and satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. Daniel was honorable. He was doing things the right way. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, 'We will never find any basis for charges against this man, Daniel, unless it has something to do with the law of his God.' So these administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said," catch this, they do a little butt kissing here. They say, "May King Darius live forever." You ever start that way with like your mom or dad? Like, "Mom, I love you so much. Can I go to my friend's house?" Or like, Mom, you look so pretty today. Can I have a friend over?" Like, you ever done this? Like, "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. Like, I forgot to do my chores, and I just love you so much." Like, this is the way they're starting right now. They're like, they're saying, they're kissing his butt. And they say, "May King Darius live forever." Right? Like, you understand what's going on here. They're kissing his butt a little bit. They're kissing his butt. They're saying, "May King Darius live forever." So they start this way because they're going to ask something. Right? He's probably like, okay, what are they going to ask? They say the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict. This is like a law, right? It says and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being for the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, butt kissing again, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. And then we see what happened. So King Darius put the decree in writing. So they just passed a law now that is across the land that says for the next 30 days you're not allowed to worship any god or human being except for the king. And it says now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. So this was a practice that he had set up in his life, that he prayed 3 times a day. He opened his window, faced Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day. And it says here, Daniel does not change his method. He keeps going. It says, just as Daniel had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. Then they said to the king, Daniel, which is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. Will you pray with me? God, thank you for this space this morning. I pray as we look at the story of Daniel that you would encourage us and challenge us to examine our own lives and to be able to learn from the life of Daniel. Daniel lived a very brave and courageous life as an exile, and I pray that we can learn from that this morning. We love you, and you're going to pray. Amen. So I want to talk about a little bit of theology this morning, just for a few moments, and I want to encourage you to kind of lean in for a second and just kind of pay attention, because it can be confusing, but I want to make it as simple as possible. But I think if we look at this theology, it will help us in our understanding of the story of Daniel. And so as we look at the story of Daniel, and we look at the Israelites throughout history, we can find 2 major movements. Okay, if we look at the Israelites were in Egypt long ago in bondage and in slavery. And this kind of marks the first movement. As you study the Bible and the life of Israel, it's called the Promised Land. The Promised Land movement, the Promised Land paradigm, is this idea that the Israelites went from Egypt out of slavery and bondage to the Promised Land. And you kind of follow the story of the Israelites through all of this, and they eventually get to the Promised Land. And this time period, this movement, follows them all the way through the Kings. And so this is kind of number 1, the Promised Land. And the second part of this is the exile. And so number 1 is the Promised Land, following them from Egypt all the way through the Kings. And then we see a twist. We see a turn in history. Israelites are not faithful. Actually, their unfaithfulness it results in a bad thing. What happens is nations come from around and they actually take down the Israelites. So what happens is that during the Promised Land period, you have the Israelites, they go to the Promised Land, they have a temple, they have a king, they have rules, all these things are placed there. They actually are created into a nation. This is the Israelite nation, and they are in the Promised Land. So that's part 1, and then we go to the exile, where their unfaithfulness leads them to actually people taking them over, and they are no longer in the Promised Land. People are scattered throughout. The temple is taken down. The king is overthrown, and their nation that was once so strong in the Promised Land is no more. So what we see here is, if we study the story of Israel, from Egypt through the Kings is this first period called the Promised Land paradigm. And then you end with their unfaithfulness as they get overthrown, and it starts the exilic paradigm, or the exile. And what happens is the people of the Israelite people were scattered throughout the nations, and they were taken as foreigners and as exiles, and they were taken into these faraway lands. And so as we look at the story of Daniel, Daniel was an Israelite. He was in Judah, and he was taken out by the Babylonians, and he was taken to Babylon. So now he is a foreigner. He is an exile in this land. And so we see this tragic story of Daniel, and what we studied in past weeks of Daniel getting pulled from Babylon. He gets placed in this new environment, in this new society, in this new culture that he has no idea about. He goes through this 3-year training where he gets completely brainwashed. He gets completely changed from the inside out to try to worship their gods, to talk their language, to do everything the way that they do it so that he can then worship the king and serve the king. And so the reality is Daniel is in exile. Daniel continues to live in Babylon as an exile, and you can hear in the story of Daniel that he's actually thriving. Right, as we read this story, it says 120 satraps rule throughout the kingdom. So there's a big guy, there's the king up top, there's Darius. And Darius then sets 120 satraps. What those people do is they go out into every corner of the nation and they rule. And I was like looking into like what is their job, and their job is to collect taxes and to set the rules and make sure that their city or their area is under control. The king up top cannot control everything. And as you think about our country, it's kind of a similar idea. You think about our country, there is the president at the top, and he is the ruler, he is the leader of our country. And as you trickle down throughout, there's a whole group around him that rule over the country under him. And then you go even lower, and then there's like state officials. So we have state officials in California. It's kind of the same idea. There's the president up top, and then there's a bunch of state officials across the nation. So as you relate it to this story, there's 120 satraps, but there's someone between King Darius and the 120. He sets these 3 people in. And Daniel is one of those 3. Daniel is like one of the top 3 people in the entire nation. And then it changes and it says, he so distinguished himself among them by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So Daniel was getting a promotion. It was the king, and then it was the 3, and then it was the 120, and Daniel's now getting a promotion as one of the 3 to now actually going higher. Daniel's like the main man. And although we study the story, and we see him as an exile, taken from his land into Babylon, and completely changed and off guard, we actually see him thriving. And as we study the story of Daniel, what we can be in awe of is that he was a faithful witness to God during his entire lifetime. He was a faithful witness to God and a good citizen in Babylon, even though he was an exile. And you say, Cobie, what does this mean to me? Like, what does this have to do for us? And the reality is, guys, we too are exiles. Do you know this? Do you know that you are a foreigner? That you too are an exile, like Daniel? You may be like, what does this mean? So I want to read you a passage, and Peter talks about this. In 1 Peter 2:11, he says, "Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul." He used this language here in his letter. He says, "Dear friends, as foreigners and exiles." He actually calls you a foreigner. He calls you an exile. And you might say, what? I'm not following, so I'm going to break this down. I'm going to try to explain this. We have this misconception as Americans that the United States is the promised land. Sometimes we have this misconception that we're still in this promised land era and that we're not in exile, but we're actually in the promised land. And I understand that the United States serves as a sort of promised land for some people. I mean, originally it was people trying to get away from government control and oppression, so they came here for freedom, for religious freedom, for all these different freedoms that we now have in America. And I don't want to deny that America, I'm proud to live here in this country. I'm proud to have the freedoms that we do. We have freedoms that across the world, man, they don't get to live like we do. We get to worship God here freely. We get to have freedom of speech and all these different freedoms that, across the world, this doesn't happen. But what I want you to catch is that this is not our home. If you are a Christian, and if you believe in Jesus, the earth, this country, is not the promised land. We are foreigners and exiles here because we belong to God, and until we are with God forever in eternity, we are forever here, a foreigner, and we are in exile. But even though we are in exile, we still have a calling. There was a letter sent to Daniel telling him what he was supposed to do in this land. And I want to read this to you guys. In Jeremiah 29, 4-7, this is crazy. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. There was a letter sent to Daniel, specifically to him and his friends, of people who were taken from Judah into Babylon. And it says, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." So this would include these people. It says, "Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry, have sons and daughters, Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you will prosper. So this idea is like we are exiles. We are in exile in this world. But this letter was sent to Daniel and his friends saying, you still have a duty. Even though you're a foreigner, and even though you've been taken over and brought to Babylon, it doesn't mean that you just give it all up. And it can be difficult sometimes to live in this country and to see the bad things that happen, the sad things that happen, and say, man, like, why do all these things happen? To just throw in the towel and say, man, this is terrible. And Daniel maybe could have done this. He could have thrown a fit, but what we look at in Daniel as we follow his story, that he actually stays faithful to God through it all. He keeps going, and his exceptional leadership qualities raise him to the top. And so this letter from Jeremiah, though, says you need to seek the peace and prosperity of the city in which you live in. And so for us, we need to seek the peace and prosperity of the nation that we live in. This is not the promised land. This is only our earthly home. We are in exile here as Christians. But we are to seek the peace and we are to seek the prosperity of this nation while we are here. And we are called to live and continue to do God's work on earth for as long as we live here. So Daniel participated in God's work in two major ways that I want to look at this morning. I want to encourage you with. And I want to look at his life a little bit more. And I want to say, okay, how can we live like Daniel? Daniel was in exile in Babylon. And so what I want to encourage you is that we too, as we are in exile, can also be faithful to God. And so I want to look at Daniel's life. And so I believe that God is calling and inviting us to participate in his work in two major ways as we look at Daniel's story. We're invited to participate in God's work. We're invited to continue to do God's work through non-participation. You might say, like, that's kind of confusing. What does that mean? So as we look at Daniel's life, he was invited as he went to Babylon to eat food that God called him not to eat. They were not allowed to eat certain kinds of foods, and as they went to Babylon, they were said, like, you're supposed to eat these food. And he said, no, God tells me I'm not allowed to. As we looked in past weeks in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel says no. He chooses non-participation when he's invited to participate. And in the same way, they were told they were not allowed to worship another God, and they were not allowed to worship another human being. And so what Daniel does here is he says, I understand that that's the rule, that's been set into place, but I'm going to continue to be faithful to God. He still gets on his hands and his knees 3 times a day and prays to God. This idea of non-participation. We can participate, we can do God's work here through non-participation. And I understand this can be confusing, so I want to break this down a little bit for you. The idea here is that we are called to live in this world as exiles, as foreigners, but we are not called to participate in the things of this world. So a little story about myself. I played baseball basically all the way through high school until I graduated, except for like the last year. And so I basically played baseball just for a super long time in my life. That was a big part of my life. And I remember being on the high school baseball team. And the high school baseball team, it was a culture. It was a thing. Like there was certain things that you did. There were certain things that you wore. There were certain things that you did. There were certain places that you went to, certain people that you hung around. And there's also a certain language that came with that. The reality is my baseball team was more than just a sports team. It was a culture. My baseball team was literally a culture built in this environment. And the reality is everybody on that team, and I don't use that word everybody lightly, the people on that team, they talked a certain way. They talked a certain way and used certain language. They would talk about girls in a bad way, and they would use language that does not really represent Christ. And I understand that they don't live according to the Bible as I try to do. But the reality is my baseball team, as they went around playing baseball, it also came with all these other things. And part of that was the language that we spoke. They would put down girls and they would talk about girls in inappropriate ways. It was terrible. And I was in the locker room with them as this went on. And then they would throw around these curse words that man, like, they're just not appropriate. And then I understand that, like, it's very common in the world that we live in. But the reality is, this does not represent Christ. And so I made a choice to not use the same language that they did. I think you guys understand what I'm talking about. I know you're not too young to hear this all the time, to hear this at your schools and to hear this in different sports teams and stuff. This is just the reality of the situation that we're in. And so as I was on this baseball team, they would use these certain words that I chose to not use. So what happened was they would ask me, Cobie, why do you not speak the way we do? Why do you not also use these words? Why do you not throw around these words like what we do? They literally would come up to me and confront me and say, Cobie, why do you not use this language? Because I chose non-participation. As the culture around me, as my baseball team would use this language and talk about people and just all these terrible things, as they did this, I chose to not participate in it. And although I got criticized, and although I got made fun of, and although I got mocked and stuff like this, the reality is I chose to stay true to this. I chose non-participation. Daniel chose non-participation, and I believe as a people of God, if you call yourself a Christian, we are called to live in this world as exiles, as foreigners, but we are called to not participate in the things of the culture around us. It says in John 15, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of this world. This is why the world hates you. The reality is, he doesn't take this, he doesn't dumb it down for you. He says, the world might actually hate you for this. I didn't choose to give in. I didn't choose to speak the way my teammates spoke. And although they probably wouldn't use the word hated, they definitely put me through a hard time. So number one is we are invited to participate in God's work. We're invited to participate in bringing peace and prosperity to our city. We are called to, as foreigners and exiles, to do God's work through non-participation. That's number one. And number two, we're invited to participate in God's work through living a practiced way of life. As we look at Daniel was disciplined. It says specifically in Daniel chapter 6 that he got on his hands and knees 3 times a day, and he opened his window towards Jerusalem and prayed. If you were at summer camp this week, Travis talked about this idea of getting up in the morning and going for a walk. You guys remember this? Those of you who were there. He said he would wake up in the morning, he would get out of his house, and he would literally go for a walk. The reality was he chose and he recognized the benefit of starting your morning with the Lord. And so we are invited to have a practiced way of life, to have spiritual disciplines, to have spiritual practices that will keep us in the longevity of this life. As foreigners and exiles, we will stay rooted in the Lord. And so I ask you this morning, are you willing to say yes to the Lord and His invitation to non-participation and to living a practiced life? And as we talk around our groups this morning, I want to encourage you to talk about practical ways we can do this. We've looked at Daniel, and I've kind of given you some of my stories, but I want to ask you the question this morning. How can you participate in God's work through non-participation? How can you say no to the things of this world and the things of our culture, number one? And then number two, how can you live a practiced way of life? How can you have spiritual disciplines and spiritual practices? What are the things that you can do to stay rooted in the Lord? Number one, participate in God's work through non-participation in our culture. And then number two, participate in God's work through a spiritual, through a practiced way of life. Will you pray with me? God, thank you for this time to be able to come and learn about Daniel. I pray that as we go into a time of sharing with each other, that we can just get honest with each other and have practical ways in which we can live in this world with non-participation and then also practice way of life. God, we love you and we thank you for your word. In your name, pray.